There's a specific time in crime research that's considered the golden age of serial killers. During the years of 1950 to 2000, it's estimated that over 2,000 serial killers just roamed the streets freely. What specifically stood out was the rise in serial murders starting around 1970 all the way through the 90s. On average, a serial killer will have his first kill around 28 years old, but what happened before then? Many child psychologists will say that the signs of this sort of behavior can happen really young, sometimes as young as 5 years old. But are murderers born, or is it something that's awakened within them, some sort of trauma? Serial killers don't just appear. There's often signs of antisocial behaviors in early childhood and adolescence. That, combined with mental illness and child abuse, sadly that's been the childhood of many, if not all, of the serial killers profiled. One FBI profile, Jim Clemente, is stated as saying, "Genetics loads the gun, their personality and psychology aim it, and their experiences pull the trigger." In February of 1949 in Salt Lake City, Mary Steinman gives birth to Gary Leon Ridgeway. As a kid, Gary suffered frequent bedwetting. His mother would clean him up, and during that time, she would inappropriately touch him, and then humiliate him in front of his brothers and his father. Gary said the actions bothered him, but he was also aroused by it. At some point, he began fantasizing about killing his mother, and in the mid-1960s, he stabbed a young boy who did survive. Gary says he led the boy into the woods and then stabbed him through the ribs into his liver. After leaving high school, Gary joined the Navy and then was eventually shipped off to Vietnam. I wasn't able to dig up any kind of confessions or any sort of crimes that were committed while he was in Vietnam, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that things did happen over there in which were probably against military protocol. I don't know what to call it, but it's safe to say that there probably was instances. Shit was crazy over there. After leaving the military, Gary killed at least 71 women, according to him. He said in court that he killed so many that he lost count. It's mentioned that he also engaged in necrophilia with the victim and sometimes went through great lengths to hide his killings. Over time in the early 80s, Gary began murdering sex workers, usually by strangulation from the rear. This happened at his home, in his truck, or some other secluded area. Gary was eventually caught, and in December 2003, the judge sentenced him to 48 life sentences with absolutely no possibility of parole, and 1 life sentence. He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence. So he's got 480 years and 48 life sentences. Another murderer to mention would be Arthur Shawcross. He was active in his killings from 1972 through 1989 in New York. After being granted early parole somehow, I have absolutely no idea how, he went on to kill and essay at least 14 women. As with Gary, he too was essayed by his mother and then later on in life had relations with his sister. He was drafted in 1967 at 21 years old. He served 1 term and later bragged about combat exploits. He mentioned beheading Amamasans and nailing their heads to trees as a warning to the Viet Cong, and engaging in cannibalism. In reality, he never served in a combat position. After coming home from war, his second wife reported that he had a need to start fires. The therapist that he was working with said that fires made him hot. Like, it turned him on. He derived sexual arousal from setting fires. Arthur died on November 10th, 2008, after complaining about leg pain that morning. True crime writer Dr. Peter Vronsky explored the link between war and serial murder. He says that 82% of serial killers in the 20th century were active between 1970 and 1999. They grew up in the 1940s and 50s, a time where so many American families were decimated by the trauma and the loss caused by the Second World War. It's his conclusion that the after effects of war can tip murderous intent or trigger some in those who may be inclined to it. And so when I did that, he says, and started to look at the birth dates of these so-called golden age serial killers, I realized they were all being raised either during the Second World War or immediately after the Second World War, in the Cold War period as well. And because the family situation is so important in the making of a serial killer, you have to look at the fathers. So what is it that might have traumatized the fathers? He asked. Because if you think about it, they were all at a war that the majority of them didn't even want to be in. They were drafted. The ones that did horrible things in war, like the rape, ritualistic necrophilia, the taking of heads, the pulling of teeth, and the collecting of human trophies, all of that stuff were a very small group. But however, think about the people who had to witness that. That had to be awful for them and equally as traumatizing. Maybe even more. But literally, that is like the beginning of the war crimes that were committed in Vietnam. One example of that is the Phoenix program. If you want me to do a video on the Phoenix program, let me know in the comments below because that shit is insane. Batshit insane. So what does that mean? I can't remember a time when there was not war. Does this mean that we're going to have a surge of serial killers here coming up? Who's to say? I don't think it's a main factor of making a serial killer, but I can see how it could give someone who had a fantasy of doing it a vessel, I guess. I do have some good news, though. After that 3-decade surge, a rapid decline of serial killers followed. There was almost 770 serial killers operating in the US through the 80s, and just under 670 in the 90s. But currently, there are 9 unsolved serial killer cases open.